Story 1. A Lone City. The first signs. The heart of the sprawling metropolis, where the lights of towering skyscrapers flickered like dying stars, there was a sense of unease. The city was never truly silent, yet tonight, something was different. The usual hum of traffic, the distant wail of sirens, and the occasional chatter of late-night wanderers seemed to fade, replaced by a strange, almost oppressive silence. Sarah Green, a young journalist, walked hurriedly down the empty street, her footsteps echoing off the cold pavement. She had just finished a late-night assignment and was eager to get home. But as she turned the corner, she felt a chill run down her spine. The streets, usually bustling even at this hour, were deserted. Not a single soul in sight. It was as if the city had been abandoned overnight. She pulled her coat tighter around her and quickened her pace. The dim streetlights cast long, eerie shadows, and every noise seemed amplified in the stillness. As she passed a row of darkened shops, she noticed something strange. The windows were covered in a thick layer of dust, as if they hadn't been touched in years. Yet, she had walked this same route just days ago, and everything had been normal. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she fumbled to answer it, grateful for the distraction. "Hello? Sarah, where are you?" It was her editor, Mark. "I'm on my way home," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. "The city feels different tonight." "Different how?" Mark's voice was tense, as if he knew something she didn't. "I don't know. It's like everyone just disappeared. The streets are empty and the shops look abandoned." There was a pause on the other end. "Get home, Sarah. Now. And lock your doors. I'll explain everything tomorrow." Before she could ask what he meant, the line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She broke into a run, her breath coming in short gasps. The silence around her was suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist as if they were alive. As she neared her apartment building, she saw something that made her heart stop. Standing under a flickering streetlight was a figure, tall and motionless. It was too dark to make out any details, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching her every move. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn and run the other way. But she was only a block away from home, and the thought of spending another minute in the eerie, deserted streets was unbearable. She steeled herself and continued forward, keeping her eyes on the ground. As she passed the figure, she felt a cold breeze brush against her, sending a shiver through her body. She dared a quick glance at the figure and immediately regretted it. The face was pale and featureless, a blank canvas of flesh with no eyes, no mouth, nothing. Just a smooth, expressionless surface. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart racing. The figure remained still, its faceless head tilted slightly as if observing her reaction. She turned and ran, not stopping until she reached the safety of her apartment building. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably, before finally managing to unlock the door. Once inside, she slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing her back against it as she tried to catch her breath. Her apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. She hurried to the window and peered out, half expecting to see the figure standing below. But the street was empty. Sarah sank to the floor, her mind racing. What was that thing? Why was the city so deserted? And what did Mark know that he wasn't telling her? She grabbed her phone and tried calling Mark again, but there was no answer. She tried a few more times before giving up, her frustration mounting. Something was very wrong, and she was determined to find out what. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the hallway outside her apartment. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a low, guttural growl. Slowly, she crept toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening intently. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and she could hear heavy footsteps approaching. Her mind raced as she tried to think of what to do. Should she stay inside and hope it would go away? Or should she make a run for it and try to find help? Before she could decide, the door rattled violently, as if something was trying to force its way in. Sarah stumbled back in terror, her heart nearly stopping. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and held it up defensively. The door shook again, harder this time, and she could hear the wood splintering under the force of the blows. Whatever was outside was not going to give up easily. Just as she was about to scream, the door flew open with a deafening crash, and a dark figure lunged at her. The encounter! Sarah's breath hitched as she heard the door splinter behind her. The dark figure lunged at her, and in a moment of sheer panic she swung the lamp with all her strength. The heavy object connected with a sickening thud, and the figure stumbled back, allowing Sarah a moment to scramble to her feet. She bolted out of the apartment, not daring to look back. The hallway was dimly lit, and the once familiar surroundings now seemed twisted and foreign. The usual comforting hum of the elevator was absent, and the walls seemed to close in on her. She sprinted down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. Every shadow seemed to hide a new terror, every sound amplified in the eerie silence of the building. As she reached the ground floor, she paused, catching her breath. The entrance door stood ajar, the cold night air seeping in. Without wasting a second, she rushed outside, only to be greeted by an unsettling sight. The city was cloaked in darkness, the streetlights flickering sporadically. The once bustling roads were now devoid of life. Cars sat abandoned, their doors open, as if their owners had fled in haste. The only sound was the distant howl of the wind, carrying with it an unsettling whisper that seemed to call her name. She froze. The voice was soft, almost seductive, but it filled her with a sense of dread. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the empty street. There was no one in sight, yet she could feel eyes watching her, waiting for her next move. The urge to run was overwhelming. But where would she go? The city, her home, had become an alien landscape, and she was its only inhabitant, or so it seemed. As she stood there, paralyzed by fear, the voice came again, closer this time. "Sarah, come to me." A figure stepped out of the shadows, its form tall and imposing. It was the same faceless being she had seen earlier, its blank, featureless face now illuminated by the flickering streetlights. It tilted its head as if studying her, and then began to move towards her with slow, deliberate steps. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. She needed to find safety, to escape this nightmare. But as the figure advanced, she realized there was no escaping it. The city was no longer hers, it belonged to them. With no other choice, she turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The voice continued to call after her, growing louder and more insistent. "Sarah, you can't escape." She ducked into a narrow alleyway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness was suffocating, but she forced herself to keep moving. The walls closed in around her, and she could feel the cold, clammy hands of fear gripping her heart. As she reached the end of the alley, she came face to face with another faceless figure. It stood silently, blocking her path, its featureless face staring at her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Before she could react, she felt a cold hand grasp her shoulder. She spun around, only to see more of them emerging from the shadows, closing in on her from all sides. Trapped, Sarah could only watch in horror as the figures surrounded her, their presence suffocating, their blank faces devoid of any emotion. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic, until they became a deafening roar in her mind. As the darkness closed in around her, Sarah felt herself slipping away, her thoughts becoming distant and fragmented. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the featureless face of the figure standing before her, its smooth surface reflecting her own terrified expression. And then, there was nothing. The awakening. Sarah awoke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. She was lying on cold, hard ground, the air thick with the stench of decay. Her head throbbed, and it took her a moment to remember where she was, or what she had been through. She sat up slowly, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. The alleyway was gone, replaced by what looked like an old, abandoned warehouse. The walls were lined with rusted machinery and broken crates, and the only light came from a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. As she stood up, she realized with a start that she wasn't alone. Figures moved in the shadows, their presence sending a chill down her spine. They were the same faceless beings that had pursued her, but now they seemed less menacing, more like shadows of their former selves. Sarah took a cautious step forward, her breath catching in her throat. The figures didn't move. They just watched her with their blank faces, their bodies almost translucent in the dim light. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself from a distance, disconnected from her own fear. She moved through the warehouse, the sound of her footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. The figures followed her silently, their movements slow and deliberate, like ghosts trapped in a loop. At the far end of the warehouse, she found a large metal door. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light seeped through the crack. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped into the unknown. The forgotten streets. Beyond the door lay a street that was both familiar and foreign. The buildings were the same, but they were crumbling, covered in ivy and decay, as if years had passed in the blink of an eye. The streetlights were shattered, their broken glass scattered across the pavement like stars fallen from the sky. Sarah walked cautiously, her senses on high alert. The figures were gone, but she could still feel their presence lingering in the shadows. The city was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of gravel beneath her feet. As she rounded a corner, she saw something that made her heart stop. A group of people, real, living people, stood huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. They looked as lost and frightened as she felt. One of them, a man in his 40s with a scruffy beard, noticed her and waved her over. "Hey, you there, are you okay?" Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was. "What's happening? Where are we?" The man shook his head. "We don't know. One minute we were at home and the next, this." He gestured around them, his voice trembling. "It's like the city just died." Another person, a woman with dark circles under her eyes, spoke up. "We've been trying to find a way out, but every street leads back to the same place. It's like we're trapped." Sarah's stomach churned with fear. "What about the faceless figures? Have you seen them?" The group exchanged uneasy glances. "We've seen them," the man said quietly. "They're not like us. They don't speak, don't eat, don't sleep. They just watch." Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "There has to be a way out," she said, more to herself than to the others. "We can't stay here." The man nodded grimly. "We thought the same, but every time we try to leave, something pulls us back. It's like the city is alive, and it doesn't want to let us go." As they spoke, a low rumbling sound echoed through the streets. The ground beneath them trembled, and the sky darkened as if a storm was approaching. The group looked around in panic, their fear palpable. "We need to find shelter," the man said urgently. "Come on, this way." Sarah followed the group as they hurried down a side street, the rumbling growing louder with each step. The buildings around them seemed to warp and twist, the windows shattered and the doors hanging off their hinges. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something rotten. They reached an old church at the end of the street, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with vines. The door was slightly ajar, and the man pushed it open, ushering the group inside. The sanctuary. The inside of the church was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of mildew. The stained glass windows were shattered, their colorful pieces scattered across the floor like broken promises. The pews were overturned, and the altar was covered in dust and cobwebs. The group moved cautiously through the nave, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The man led them to a small room at the back of the church, its door hanging off its hinges. Inside, they found a few old blankets and some dusty cans of food, likely left behind by others who had sought refuge here. "We'll rest here for now," the man said, his voice weary. "But we can't stay too long. This place, it's not safe." Sarah sat down on one of the blankets, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the faceless figures were just outside, waiting for the right moment to strike. The woman with dark circles under her eyes sat down beside her. "I'm Elena," she said softly. "You're Sarah, right?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, do you have any idea what's happening?" Elena shook her head, her expression grim. But whatever it is, it's not natural. It's like the city has been possessed." Sarah felt a chill run through her. "Do you think we'll ever get out of here?" Elena was silent for a moment. Then she looked at Sarah with a mixture of fear and determination. "We have to. There's no other option." As they spoke, the rumbling outside grew louder, the ground shaking violently. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. The sound of the city crumbling around them was deafening, and Sarah could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Suddenly, the door to the room burst open, and a figure stepped inside. It was one of the faceless beings, its featureless face reflecting the fear in their eyes. The group recoiled in horror, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them with its blank, expressionless face. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with tension, and Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked back out of the room, leaving the door ajar. "What the hell was that?" the man whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Elena replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think it wants us to follow it." Sarah felt a surge of fear and curiosity. "Are you crazy? We can't follow it. What if it's leading us into a trap?" Elena looked at her, her eyes filled with desperation. "Do we have any other choice?" Sarah didn't have an answer. The truth was they were trapped, and any chance of escape, no matter how dangerous, was better than waiting to be consumed by the city. The descent. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear evident in the dim light. But as the rumbling outside grew louder, the walls of the church trembling with the force, they knew they had to make a decision. With a resigned nod, the man led the way, following the faceless figure out of the room and into the darkened nave. Sarah and Elena followed closely, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The figure moved ahead of them, its movement smooth and deliberate, as if it knew exactly where it was going. As they stepped out into the street, the group was met with an eerie sight. The city was changing, the buildings warping and twisting as if they were alive. The streets were no longer straight but curved and winding, leading in unpredictable directions. The sky above was dark, swirling with ominous clouds that seemed to pulse with energy. The faceless figure led them down a narrow alleyway, the walls on either side closing in as they descended deeper into the heart of the city. The air grew colder, and the sound of the rumbling grew louder, as if they were nearing the source. Sarah's heart raced as they reached a large iron gate at the end of the alley. The figure stopped in front of it, its blank face turned towards the group as if waiting for them to make the next move. The man hesitated, then stepped forward and pushed the gate open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the narrow space. Beyond the gate was a set of stone stairs, descending into darkness. The group exchanged fearful glances, but there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, they followed the figure down the stairs, each step taking them further from the city they once knew. As they descended, the air grew colder, and the darkness around them thickened. The walls of the staircase were rough and uneven, as if carved out of the earth itself. The sound of their footsteps echoed eerily, the only noise in the oppressive silence. Finally, they reached the bottom of the stairs, where a massive, ancient door stood before them. It was covered in strange symbols, etched, "The doorway to darkness." The ancient door loomed before them, its surface covered in strange, cryptic symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The group hesitated, the cold air thick with dread as they stood at the threshold of something far more sinister than they had imagined. Sarah felt a sense of unease wash over her, as if the very ground beneath her feet was alive. The faceless figure that had guided them here now stood motionless, its blank face tilted toward the door as if waiting for them to take the next step. The man with the scruffy beard reached out tentatively, his hand trembling as he touched the cold metal of the door. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the space, and the symbols on the door began to glow faintly. With a soft creak, the door began to open, revealing a yawning abyss of darkness beyond. A gust of freezing air blew through the opening, sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. She glanced at the others. Their faces were pale, fear etched in their eyes. "We have to go through," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's the only way." Reluctantly, they stepped forward, one by one, into the unknown. The darkness swallowed them whole, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. The rumbling from the city above seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on them like a living thing. As they ventured deeper into the darkness, the faint glow of the symbols on the door was the only thing guiding their way. The walls of the tunnel were rough and uneven, as if carved by ancient hands, and the ground beneath their feet was cold and damp. The faceless figure moved ahead of them, its form barely visible in the dim light. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as they walked in silence, the tension building with every step. Suddenly, the tunnel widened, opening into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling stretched high above them, disappearing into the shadows, and strange, twisted structures lined the walls, their forms warped and unnatural. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, its surface covered in the same cryptic symbols as the door. The air around the altar seemed to hum with a dark energy, and a low, rhythmic chant echoed through the chamber, though no one could see where it was coming from. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what they had stumbled upon. This was no ordinary place. It was a temple, an ancient, forgotten temple dedicated to something far older and far more powerful than they could comprehend. The ritual begins. The air grew thick with tension as the group approached the stone altar, the rhythmic chanting growing louder and more insistent. The faceless figure stood still, its featureless face turned toward the altar as if in reverence. The man with the scruffy beard moved cautiously toward the altar, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chanting. Elena stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "It's some kind of ritual site," she said softly. "But for what, I don't know." The symbols on the altar began to glow brighter, and the air hummed with a sinister energy. The chanting grew louder, filling the chamber with an overwhelming sense of dread. Sarah could feel the power in the air, pressing down on her like a physical force. Whatever was happening here, it was far beyond their understanding. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and the walls of the chamber seemed to pulse with energy. The faceless figure raised its hands, as if beckoning something from the depths of the darkness. Without warning, the symbols on the altar flared to life, casting a blinding light throughout the chamber. Sarah shielded her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. When the light faded, she gasped in horror at what she saw. Standing before the altar was a figure, tall and imposing, its form shrouded in shadows. Its face was obscured, but its presence was undeniable, a being of immense power and malevolence. The chanting grew louder, reaching a fevered pitch as the figure raised its arms. The air crackled with energy, and Sarah could feel the ground trembling beneath her feet. The ritual had begun,